Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to interview David Carpenter. David is a graduate of the Harvard Medical School. He's got over 435 peer-reviewed publications and 6 books. This guy is an absolute wealth of knowledge in the area of how the environment is impacting our health. Now, transparently, this conversation was hard for me because it's going to be hard for you to listen to, because it allows us to understand the fact that a lot of these things in the environment are so far beyond our control. I felt helpless talking to him as he taught me about all of the environmental influences that are possibly contributing to our ultimate demise as a human species. It's a very, very powerful conversation as we discuss the things that you've never heard about that are impacting your health. So we get into EMFs, which you've heard about, and how those are impacting your health. But we also talk about things in the air that we don't even know that exist and that are crushing our health and that we need to start becoming aware of. We talk a little bit about things in the water, things in the food, and so many interesting conversations around how to become aware and maybe start testing for these things. And ultimately, guys, if you really want to start taking care of your life and the life of your loved ones, you got to start paying attention to these things and potentially getting behind creating a movement to change it, as you hear me talking about in the podcast. And if this is something you guys are passionate about, like I am, reach out to me and let me know, because ultimately, if we have a good group of people that can get behind it, we can start making a movement to change it, because ultimately our life matters, the life of our family matters. And as you hear in this conversation with David Carpenter, we may be fighting an uphill battle, and I hope you guys enjoy this conversation. It's not a negative conversation by any stretch, but it's certainly very eye-opening. We're obviously being exposed to more and more EMF, right? It seems to be everywhere. It seems to be absolutely inescapable. What are some of the implications of being exposed to this stuff? You talk about human disease, and you talk about free radical damage. Like, what does that lead to downstream?
Well, the concern is they're at several levels. I think the biggest concern is the long-term effect of all this exposure, and it is increasing at an enormous rate. I mean, almost everybody has a cell phone. You can't go into many establishments. Every Starbucks, every McDonald's has Wi-Fi. Most of our homes have Wi-Fi. Now there's this rollout of the 5th generation higher frequency communication system, which is going to involve putting a mini cell tower in front of about every 5th or 7th house on every suburban street in the whole country. It's going to mean that nobody can escape exposure almost continuously to these radio frequency fields. Now, the strongest evidence for harm for the lower frequency fields is cancer. But the latency between exposure for any environmental agent and development of cancer, especially brain cancer, is long. It's 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years. So the question is, what's going to happen 20 years from now when we have a whole generation of people that were really exposed in ways that people of my generation were not? And are we going to see a significant increase in rates of certain kinds of cancer? Now, let me talk a little about cancer in general. The studies I got involved in way back when were focused on childhood leukemia in children that lived in homes that had power lines outside their house that generated high magnetic fields. And our studies showed that those children with high magnetic fields outside were more at risk of developing leukemia. Now, since that time, there's been replication of those studies. It's not a huge increase in risk, but it's significant. And it's now been demonstrated that adults aren't immune either, that men and women that work in occupations where they have high exposure to magnetic fields from electricity have more leukemia. And now there is evidence that people that live close to very high-powered radio transmission towers, where now the whole body is exposed to radio frequency fields. These also have elevated risks of leukemia, especially in children. That's been well documented around Vatican radio, which is extremely high-powered, projects all over Europe, and a number of studies from Korea that looked at a number of high-powered radio stations. The evidence for brain cancer and cell phone use is very convincing at this stage of the game. An elevated risk of brain cancer only on the side of the head that you tend to hold your cell phone. And it's primarily glioblastoma, which is a cancer of the glial cells of the nervous system, much less so with meningioma, which is a different kind of brain cancer. And now evidence that there is a tumor of the auditory nerve called a schwannoma or acoustic neuroma, also because people hold their cell phone right to their head. Some evidence for salivary gland tumors. And recently, the National Toxicology Program and the Ramazzini Institute in Italy have, for the first time, demonstrated these very same cancers in rats and mice exposed to cell phone frequency. So I think we can take it as pretty well definitively shown that excessive exposure to cell phone frequencies increases brain cancer, and schwannomas that can occur in the peripheral part of the nervous system as well.
Is it just from the massive accumulation of oxidative stress? And if so, is there any people at your level obviously researching ways to mitigate this? If we know we're going to be exposed to it for indefinitely, the awareness, it just blows my mind. The awareness of this stuff is obviously prevalent. Like, people who are executing on these 5G towers know this is going to happen. So it feels in my mind that someone has to know what the cure is or what the solution is. Otherwise, how could we morally subject ourselves to that?
Well, a good question, and I don't have an easy answer for it, because I don't think morally we can accept that we're all being exposed to this and nobody's raising a caution flag. It's certainly true that life on Earth evolved with some exposure to electromagnetic fields. But we have just so massively increased our exposure in such a short period of time that we really don't have evidence as to what the long-term effect is going to be. And as you say, most people are relatively oblivious. We like our technology. We don't think about it being dangerous, and therefore tend to just ignore the problems.
Absolutely incredible. What do you see, talking about the mechanism? So is it, like we say, just going to be the poor DNA transcription, like interfering with DNA transcription, or is it going to be the oxidative stress?
Well, I think there's a lot of debate on that. My personal view is that the evidence primarily points to oxidative stress. And then oxidative stress can trigger all kinds of other effects. We know that there's a change in the metabolism of the brain, that there's a change in blood flow when you hold a cell phone to your ear. We have a lot of evidence for oxidative stress on the male reproductive system. Clearly, there is a reduction in sperm counts and sperm viability with people that wear their cell phone in an active mode on their belt. It's interesting, there are now beginning to be studies in humans, not just in animals, that show that if you have a wireless laptop on your lap for a couple of hours, you probably don't need to wear a condom for the next week or so, because the sperm are damaged, and that damage is reversed or prevented by free radical scavengers. So that, in that case, the evidence is very strong that it's oxidative stress. Now, there's also beginning evidence that there's also a reduction in testosterone in men that either use cell phones excessively. Now, some evidence, not a terribly convincing study, but studies that have looked at people living close to cell towers as compared to people living further away, showing reduction in testosterone. We know that there's been a decline in sperm count in developed countries over the last 20, 30 years. I'm not saying it's all due to electromagnetic fields, but that certainly is one contributing factor. Now, the evidence for oxidative stress for the central nervous system effects is a little less clear. It's interesting. I was in the Harvard Physicians' Health Study where we took pills for a long time, not knowing whether they were active or not active. And many of those were things like vitamin E and vitamin C that were meant to reduce oxidative stress. And the question is, did they reduce the rates of cancer? The conclusion was, we know they block free radicals, but they didn't do much on preventing cancer. So it isn't easy to demonstrate the protective effects of free radical generation, but I still think that's very likely the central common mechanism. And then you have all of these other subsequent effects like changes in brain metabolism, changes in cerebral blood flow, changes in calcium channels and so forth, that all are a result of the oxidative stress that you get.
In your opinion, your experience, is it just the signals that are very close in proximity? Or do we have a concern with, obviously if it's a radio tower outside your house, that's a lot of EMF in a very relatively close proximity. But, some people have the opinion that it's just cell phones being held to your head or in your pocket. Is it something to be concerned with that, if there's a Wi-Fi signal in the house or if there's 10 Wi-Fi signals around your house, in your opinion, your experience, do you think that we need to be concerned with that? Or is that just, not going to affect us that much?
I think we need to be very concerned with that. Pretty clearly, we're all exposed at one level, but it's the more intensity, the greater the risk of disease. Now, I'm particularly concerned about the fact that so many schools have a Wi-Fi computer classroom. Mm-hmm. We have 20, 30 kids sitting on a wireless laptop. It's like a little mini microwave oven. Now, there's a disease outcome I hadn't mentioned yet, but I think it's an important one and it's growing. And that's called this electrohypersensitivity. It's a syndrome with very nonspecific symptoms, particularly headache, fatigue, feeling like your brain doesn't work quite right. We're seeing this in school children that spend a lot of time in excessive Wi-Fi environments. We're seeing it among a number of adults. I've been particularly impressed by, there's a whole literature from the Defense Department of service persons who were accidentally exposed to radar at high intensity, developed these symptoms of headache, flushing, feeling sometimes of nausea and vomiting, and then never recover. Always have this reaction to exposure to radio frequency fields. I've spoken to individuals that, one particular individual that I've actually met and examined, who was a technician for a radio generation facility. It was all supposed to be turned off when he went in to do the maintenance on it. It wasn't all turned off. He was in there an hour, he got sick. 3 years later, he still suffers for all these symptoms of electrohypersensitivity. It's a small percentage of the population that have these symptoms, but as our exposure continually increases, it may well get to be a larger percentage of the population.
What physiological changes are they seeing? Like, is there any, notable blood markers? Is there any notable, identifiable traits of this characteristic?
Well, there's a lot of research on that. I have a colleague in Paris, Dominique Belpomme, who has published a whole series of clinical chemistry tests. As a matter of fact, he and I have a paper that just came out about 3 weeks ago, which I'll be happy to send you if you're interested.
You'd love to. I'll link to it in the show notes.
He has developed a whole series of tests where there are positive results at a higher percentage of people with electrohypersensitivity than people that don't have the symptoms. And it's very similar to those individuals that have multiple chemical sensitivity. Unfortunately, only one of the tests appears to be very specific. Most of them, they're 75% higher in the people with EHS than those without it. But there's a lot of research in this area. Now, it is also clear that there's some people that don't feel very well and they want to blame the cell phone towers and so forth, but they really don't demonstrate that they respond if they don't know they're being exposed. Mm-hmm. So there's a psychological component in some people, but in most of the people that I've spoken with and even walk down the street with, they can tell you, we're coming up to a cell tower because I'm feeling it. So it's we need these objective clinical tests, and they're just now being developed.
How much of a difference do you think there's going to be in our exposure levels between the 4G and the 5G cell phone towers?
There's going to be a massive difference because these 5G are going to be placed on light poles or telephone poles, or they're going to be erecting poles on every street, and they're going to be right by everybody's house. You're not going to be able to walk down the sidewalk without being continuously exposed at the intensities that people that now live near a 3G or 4G cell tower are. That's going to add to the other exposures that are common in our daily life. So I expect that we're going to see a great increase in people suffering from electrohypersensitivity, from reduced fertility, especially in males, although there's some evidence that also there's an effective fertility in females. And the biggest concern is the long-term increases in cancers.
Is there a way for us to find out where these cell towers exist? So like, are they very easy to spot with the naked eye, or is there something like, my concern as a parent and as a, homeowner, ultimately, like, I don't want to be near this stuff. And it seems like it's going to be everywhere, but is there that, of a way to identify or, website that exists where someone can go like, hey, I can kind of see the geographical location of all these things?
Well, right now they're being placed without any public announcement almost all over the world. I get emails regularly from Australia, from Europe, of people that were upset because they suddenly find that one of these 5G cell towers is put on their street. If you know what they look like, you could probably identify them. They're not big. They're just an attachment on the cell tower, on the light pole telephone pole, or they're put up on a separate pole if you have underground electricity and so forth. But the big problem right now is they're only now being implemented, and the companies are doing this slowly in different areas. I know here in New York, I have any number of people are emailing me constantly, trying to oppose the placement of these 5G towers in their streets. Yeah. But there's very little legal room to oppose them.
So there's nothing we can do as far as, creating some type of movement to prevent this stuff. I know a lot of people want it. Like, it's ridiculous how, attached we are to fast internet, right? As soon as it slows down for 5 minutes,
right,
that's a big problem. Like, it's a huge, first world problem to have. But from your experience, there's nothing we can do right now to, create a movement to prevent these things being executed, even in certain states, or removed as quickly as possible? Or is there going to be a lot of backlash from these cell phone companies?
Well, there's going to be backlash, but there certainly are things we can do. And as with everything else, we have a whole political system that can respond to these concerns, but it's only going to respond if people bang on the table and get their attention. Now, one of the faults on this whole issue dates to an act of Congress from the Federal Communications Act back in 1996, which basically had a provision snuck in by the industry saying you couldn't object to placement of a cell phone tower based on concern about health effects.
Really?
To my mind, that's unconstitutional, but that is the law. And the industry has used that to say we don't have to ask anybody's permission to place these things there. I was involved in a case here in New York where a community was opposing a cell tower, not a 5G. This predated 5G, on the basis of health effects, but they were prohibited from doing that. But they were able to oppose it based on the fact that it was ugly. So you can't be concerned about your health, but you can be concerned about local beauty, which is just ludicrous.
Wow.
So I think the solution is political activism. And this is what everybody needs to do. You need to holler at your local mayor, at your state representatives, and especially at your federal representatives. This provision of that 1996 Federal Communications Act simply must be removed. But that requires an act of Congress. And it is not the ordinary citizen that has the funds to lobby their congressman in relation to that of the telecommunications industry.
Right. But podcasting is pretty cool because, between myself and my colleagues, we probably have, certainly millions and maybe tens of millions of people who listen to us. And if we created a movement toward that, it's a very quick way to access a lot of people. And if we can create an argument that says, hey, like these things are hurting us, we should probably create some type of activist movement. Maybe we have the power to do it, which is pretty awesome.
I think that's awesome. And I think that's really essential to do because it's not just that this is such an onerous thing. It's also that many people don't understand. They like the convenience of modern technology, but they don't understand the downside. And, being able to download a movie in a few seconds shorter time is really not something that is going to adversely impact your quality of life greatly. It may impact your quality of life when you develop your cancer.
And die, yeah. Or one of your loved ones does.
That's right.
Even often worse. I'm always saying of myself, I'm like, if I get sick and die, that's great. But I'm more concerned about my family and how they're going to feel when I get sick and die.
Yes. And the other factor there, again, it's an area that I've been very involved in. There's growing evidence that the learning ability of a child is reduced if they're exposed to these radio frequency fields.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're influencing, we're electrical beings, right? And if you're influencing their ability to transmit electrical signals through their nervous system, it's absolutely
You're changing the metabolism of the brain. Yeah. Yes. Now, there's also a concern about kids being addicted to this technology, which adds to their exposure. So the addiction is certainly not good, but the exposure has its own direct effects on the cognitive ability of the brain. And if there's anything a parent wants, it's to not have their child's mental development impacted because of some exposure that they could control if they would.
Hey, I interrupt the podcast to bring you a message about blueberries. You guys know my infatuation with blueberries is real. Why? Massive brain benefits from the polyphenols, antioxidants, nitric oxide benefits, so many things about berries in general that I absolutely love, and I make them a consistent part of my day-to-day life. Here's the problem. Eating as many blueberries as you need to see a benefit is very, very expensive. Looking around $5 to $6 per serving when I buy them fresh. And even when I buy them frozen, it's still in the range of $4 to $5 for the size of serving that I'm after, which is somewhere in the range of 2 cups per serving. And I usually have that about twice a day. So what I've started doing probably for the last 6 months is after every workout, I'm consuming at least 2 servings of Organifi Red. So as you guys have heard, my friend Drew Canoli started this business, Organifi, and he's doing an incredible job sourcing really high-quality ingredients and putting them into convenient servings that allow you to easily access superfoods and amazing nutrients. So Drew has so graciously offered to give all of the Muscle Intelligence listeners or the Muscle Expert podcast listeners 20% off anything you get from Organifi. But you got to act now because that's not going to last forever. You can use the code Muscle Intelligence when you go to Organifi.com to get 20% off your entire order. And I think you're awesome, and Drew does too. So enjoy the rest of the show. From your experience, do you feel that EHS is an environmental exposure thing, or is that a congenital predisposition thing? Meaning, I feel like I'm, the canary in the coal mine. Like you put me beside a cell phone and I could feel it. I can feel it when it's in my pocket. Is that something that I've developed due to extreme exposure, or is that something that I'm just maybe more in tune with my nervous system, so I happen to feel it?
Well, for almost every environmental exposure, there is a factor called genetic susceptibility,
Sure.
in that some people are more vulnerable than others. However, I think this is a real exposure issue. And I've been so impressed at so many of the people that have EHS can pinpoint a certain exposure that was excessive, after which they developed EHS. Now, in not all cases was it a single point in time. It may have been a job that they had for 6 months that involved very high levels of exposure. And the symptoms that people experience vary by degree. My wife's a case in point. She's very skeptical about EHS, but she kept saying, boy, I get ringing in my ears when I sit around in my chair watching television. I pointed out that, well, the Wi-Fi router was right there by you. Why don't you get rid of that? She moved it to the other side of the room. She still doesn't acknowledge that her ringing in her ears, which is a common side effect of EHS, was due to her exposure. But in some people, that's not a terribly disruptive thing. But to have the brain cognitive dysfunction, to have the headaches, to have the photophobia, those things are very serious, and they can drastically impact your quality of life.
So, moving along from EMF, I know this is a massive thing, but you're also someone who's an authority on speaking on the negative health implications of organic chemicals. Can we talk about that a little bit, and which ones are
Sure.
the greatest concern, and how we can start to protect ourselves?
Well, it's very difficult to focus on which ones are of greatest concern, because there's so many chemicals, they have so many different effects. And again, you can sort of start with diseases. Cancer, we've heard a lot just in the last few days about glyphosate and cancer. Almost all pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, if they kill other little insects and plants, they're certainly not going to do anything good in humans. A lot of my research has been focused on PCBs and chlorinated pesticides. These are easy to study because they're very persistent. So you can take a blood sample and basically determine how much exposure someone had over many, many years. And we know that these cause cancer. A lot of my work has been on diabetes and hypertension and heart disease, also on deficits of IQ. The lists of diseases just go on and on. They interfere with endocrine systems, cause reduction of thyroid function. PCBs and a number of these pesticides act like estrogen. So they tend to feminize baby boys. They tend to increase the risk of breast cancer in women. They tend to promote earlier puberty, later menopause. So whether these are diseases or not, they're interfering with normal biological functions. There's a lot of concern now, appropriately, for the components that are in plastics, the bisphenol A and the other bisphenol compounds, the phthalates. These all mimic estrogen. They're not as potent as natural estrogen, but they activate the estrogen receptor, and they do all the things that estrogen does. Estrogen is a known human carcinogen. Granted, it's a normal hormone, but in excessive amounts, it increases risk of breast cancer and other endocrine cancers. And the difference between males and females is the ratio of the male to the female hormones, sex hormones. So that relationship is perturbed if you're exposed to exogenous estrogenic compounds, or for that matter, to exogenous androgenic compounds. So chemicals can just interfere with almost every aspect of human physiology and metabolism.
Where are our greatest exposures from your experience?
Well, traditionally, everybody has always thought that the greatest exposure was in the food we eat. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to say that's not an important exposure. A lot of these chemicals, especially the more persistent ones, are fat soluble. So they're in all animal fats, and they bioaccumulate Easiest example is if you have a contaminated body of water. The chemicals are in the sediments. They get eaten by little worms and bugs that live in the sediments, that get eaten by little fish, that get eaten by big fish, and so on up the chain till they're eaten by humans. And the amount of these chemicals, because they're persistent, they bioaccumulate. So the concentration is higher as you go up the food chain. That is an important route of exposure. But our results recently have increasingly focused on the chemicals that are in the air. And we've demonstrated a number of years ago that if you live by a hazardous waste site that has some of these chemicals, including things like PCBs and DDT, they're not thought of as being very volatile, but they are in fact volatile. And you have to breathe 24/7. And if they're in the air, they'd rather be in your body than in the air. And we have a recent study of diabetes in the Native American population where it's been known for quite a while that PCBs increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. But when we looked carefully at the different PCBs, we find the ones that are most associated with diabetes in this population are the more volatile congeners, the PCBs that have fewer chlorines, that are more volatile in the air. And we think the biggest route of exposure of that is important for diabetes is breathing the air. So the punchline.
Where would one find PCB? Sorry to cut you out, but where would, it's just, what are we using them for?
We haven't, in the US, we outlawed them in 1977. But because they're so persistent, they're in everything.
Wow.
They're in every animal fat. They're in milk. They're in eggs. They tend to be much less present in vegetables, in vegetable oils, but they're everywhere, and they're in the air. So we all breathe them at some level. Now, because they go in the air, they migrate. So they go from land into, for example, the biggest input into Lake Michigan these days comes from the air blowing over Chicago. There are PCBs from old waste sites there. They go into the air and deposit over Chicago. I have some studies in northern Alaska, way away from any industrial site, but people up there have high exposure to PCBs. It's the air transport from temperate regions where they come out of the vapor phase when it gets very cold, and then bioconcentrate in the food supply there. Very difficult to know how to avoid exposure.
What was the original use of PCB?
They were used for many things. They're an oil. Their primary use was as an insulator in capacitors and transformers. But then they were also added to paint. Oil-based paint used to be PCBs instead of mineral oil. A big problem today is that the caulking around windows and doors, if it was done before 1975 or so, caulk was dissolved in PCBs. So we have a lot of problem in schools now. Old schools where the caulking has been around forever, the PCBs in the air in the classrooms are elevated and kids are breathing them in.
How do we test that?
It's relatively easy to do a PCB analysis. However, it's very expensive. We had this situation in Malibu, California, where EPA has a standard that if there's more than 50 parts per million of PCBs in an open use like caulk, you have to remove it. That standard does not say that if you think it's more than 50 parts per million, but you don't test it, you have to remove it. So parents in this school district were concerned. They had tests in certain of the classrooms. And in one case, there were 3 classrooms in a row. They tested the first and the third, but not the middle one. The first and third had elevated PCBs, so they had to be remediated. But the school board refused to test the middle one because they'd have to remediate it if they tested it.
That's
asinine.
Unbelievable. I mean,
well, fortunately, in that case, the parents went to court, and the school board was required to test every classroom and remediate all of those with elevated PCBs. But even though we haven't made them for a long time, we're all exposed to them.
Getting into the food-based ones, because I'm very interested. If there's additional ones in the air, I'd love to talk about that, because a lot of people are talking about glyphosate, a lot of people are talking about atrazine, a lot of people are talking about what's in the water. I've never really heard anybody talk about what's in the air. Is there more things we need to be concerned with? And if so, how do we test?
Well, there are so many things we should be concerned about. I've also been very involved in the issues of the contaminants in the air from fracking sites and natural gas. Now, natural gas is primarily methane. Methane is not known to be particularly dangerous, but natural gas, as it comes out of the ground, has a number of volatile organics that are causing cancer. Benzene, 1,3-butadiene, formaldehyde is everywhere. All of these are known human carcinogens, and they're being released continuously. Now, if you fill your gas tank at a gas station, you're going to be breathing in a little benzene, because there is benzene in gasoline. There have been now studies of the symptoms that people have if they live around these fracking sites, or probably the most dangerous are the compressor stations, where the natural gas is being compressed and moved along in pipelines, and you get a lot of releases of these volatile organics. Volatile organics are neurotoxins in addition to carcinogens. They cause some of these nonspecific symptoms: headache, nausea, vomiting. They cause rashes. They cause sore throats or nasal passages. So a whole variety of things. The methane releases that you've had in California, I've been involved a little bit in discussion of the health effects that people there have experienced because of that. We're all exposed to a whole variety of nasty things. It's unavoidable to a degree, but it is avoidable to a degree. And we really depend on both industry and government to do what they can to reduce these exposures to the greatest degree possible.
So if I have a leak on my street, what's my first line? Any suggestions? Is it like call your city councilor? Is it like a way to get tested? Anything you know of that would allow the typical person listening to assess this stuff?
Well, I think calling for immediate action by whoever is responsible for the leak is the thing to do. Depending on how serious the leak is, it may even be wise to leave the area until it's repaired. Now, granted, that sometimes doesn't happen immediately, but breathing in something that causes cancer, where the cancer is unlikely to appear for certainly not less than 5 years, probably more like 10 or 20 years, it's very hard to know what the magnitude of that risk is. But there's no question but there's an increase in risk if you're exposed to something that causes cancer. Now, the damage to the brain is probably more temporary, but it can still be very significant.
So if someone has a leak on their street, are they still going to have massive exposure in their house, or is it going to dissipate by the time they're getting into their house? That's always my thing, is like, if we have something in our area, are you safe inside your house because, maybe it's distance and enclosure, or is it still something like you got to get the heck out of there?
Well, you're certainly safer inside the house if you don't have the windows open and don't have a lot of circulation of outside air. However, most of us have circulation of outside air. So for many chemicals, the indoor environment is more dangerous than the outdoor. The outdoor, at least, the winds move things around, and in the indoor environment, it can be trapped. So again, I think there's no easy answer, but I think it's a mistake to assume that just because you're inside, you're avoiding exposure.
Incredible. So I know I wanted to move on to what's happening in the food quality, like in our food that we eat. But before that, I'd like to have you talk about the implications in water. So, I've become so aware of everything that's potentially being exposed to in our water. Is there anything that comes to mind that is a massive concern from your end?
Well, again, you can sort of go through the same list of chemicals. They
just runoff.
Runoff is important, but there are all these legacy chemicals that are in the water. I've recently gotten very caught up in the PFOA, the perfluorinated compounds. We have a situation very near here in Albany, where a community that had plastic manufacturers that went out of business 15 years ago contaminated all the groundwater, including the municipal water and the well water, with PFOA, perfluorinated compound that, like PCBs, it has fluorines, not chlorines, like the brominated flame retardants that have bromine. These chemicals with halogens are very resistant to being destroyed, both in the environment and in our bodies, but they're very dangerous compounds. PFOA is well documented to increase the risk of certain kinds of cancer, especially kidney and testicular cancer. And it's very difficult to clean up. So, why does it take 20 years after the company's closed to even discover that the groundwater is contaminated? Certainly there are pesticides, there are a variety of other chemicals that are not good to have in your drinking water. We know about lead in Flint. Lead is a problem still everywhere. Arsenic is a problem in drinking water. We depend on our government to protect us. And in general, the U.S. is very fortunate because we have better drinking water standards than most parts of the world do. But some things, there are no standards. PFOA is a case in point. EPA didn't have a standard. They had an advisory level, which was ludicrously high, and they had no enforceable standards. So they're the bad things we know about. Most of them, we have at least some level of protection. And then there are a whole variety of things that we're only now beginning to find out about.
This seems like, we're kind of doomed no matter what direction we turn, right? You can't breathe, you can't drink, you can't go outside.
My students tell me that what I teach them in my class is it's dangerous to breathe the air, drink the water, eat the food, and we're all going to die. But that's probably true, but it would be nice to delay the last part as long as possible.
Okay, so that extends the conversation. I'm going to skip right over the food because I think we already know. We already know it's probably the same things. It's probably adding on the extra pesticides and herbicides. And I've had people on to talk about that stuff and the just relevant prevalence everywhere. What are you doing on a day-to-day basis to start preventing the obvious effects of EMF and PFOAs and all these other chemicals that, you're being exposed to, I'm being exposed to? Where do we start?
Well, I think there are a lot of things one can do that will reduce your exposure. Let's talk about EMF first.
Yeah.
Everybody laughs at me because I certainly have my cell phone, but I have difficulty remembering my cell phone number because it's not usually turned on. I have a landline on my office. I have a landline at home. I don't hesitate to use my cell phone when I'm traveling, when I need to, but I don't have it on all the time. And I use a landline most of the time. That isn't a great disruption of your life. I don't walk down the street talking on my cell phone, running into people like some people do. I have Wi-Fi in my house, but the router's away from where I spend a lot of time. Again, I don't freak out about that, but I think it reduces exposure. I'm fortunate because I have a farm. I raise a lot of my own food. I raise a lot of my own animals.
Oh, great.
And I know that they're not exposed to excessive pesticides. Actually, they're not exposed to pesticides at all. And now, not everybody can do that, but there are, again, simple things to do. Wash your vegetables well. Buy organic when you can. Now, unfortunately, organic foods are more expensive, and so there are a lot of people that can't afford that.
Do you think that the organic ones are that much better? It seems like the idea of runoff, the idea of blowing in the wind, like these exposures in the U.S. it seems unavoidable.
It is unavoidable. And that much better, I can't say they're that much better. I think they are better. Studies that have been done where organic broccoli versus non-organic broccoli was tested for pesticides. There are differences. But again, we're all exposed to these things. We can't avoid it totally. But simple things to do that will reduce our exposure is the place to start. And one needs to start with some knowledge. What foods have more contaminants versus what have fewer contaminants? For most of these chemicals, they're going to be more concentrated in the fat than in non-fat. I was involved in these studies of farm versus wild salmon a number of years ago, and we found that farm salmon from Northern Europe, you could eat one meal every 5 months without increasing your risk of cancer. But any more than that,
what was the
cause a significant increase in risk.
What was the chemical that was most prevalent, or the risk the thing that increased risk factor?
Well, we monitored 14 chemicals. It was PCBs, dioxins, DDT, and other chlorinated pesticides. And each of them had their own risk of cancer. Almost all of them did. But the fact was that they all migrated together. So when you ate a contaminated fish, it wasn't just one of those chemicals you were getting a mixture of all of them. And EPA has a formula that allows you to determine how many fish meals you should eat per month, depending on the different chemicals that are known to cause cancer and their concentration. Now, that issue has sort of gone away, but it was a big deal when we did those studies back in the early 2000s. There still are chemicals in fish, but the chemicals are also in beef and pork and chicken and eggs and milk. And they're because these contaminants have gotten diffused through our food supply, because part of commercial agriculture now is to put waste animal fat in the food that animals eat. So we're recycling all these nasty chemicals again and again and again.
Geez, what do we say? Absolutely incredible. Are you eating substantially less meat than vegetables just to mitigate the exposures? I know you said you grow a lot of your own, but curious.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that I do. Again, I'm pretty confident that most of the meat that I eat is not highly contaminated. I eat a lot of vegetables. I have a wonderful garden, but I don't think I've changed my dietary habits, particularly in relation to concern about the dangers of meat. Now, let me talk about that a little bit. There's red meat sort of has a bad reputation, but usually the dangers are red and processed meat. And it's the processed meat that have the chemical carcinogens that are added to them.
Sure.
The only thing that people can say about red meat is there's more iron in red meat than in white meat. And iron can generate reactive oxygen species. But I'm unconvinced that red meat that is not pickled or smoked or processed is particularly dangerous, except for the chemicals that are primarily in the animal fats.
Right. Is there anywhere in the world that you believe actually has a better environmental scenario?
Not really.
No.
As I say, I've got this major study in northern Alaska, St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, off the coast of Nome. You can see the mountains of Russia on a clear day, which I'm sure Sarah Palin never did. But those poor people are highly contaminated. Mm-hmm. And it's through no fault of their own. They're not by local industry. There's some former military bases nearby that contribute to it, but a lot of it is atmospheric transport. The tropics aren't clean. We all have a responsibility to try to reduce this pollution that we've all caused. Humankind has caused over centuries, but particularly in the last few decades.
Which of these exposures are you most concerned with?
I think right now Well, a lot of my interest has been focused on brain and brain development. So any exposure that reduces IQ, shortens attention span, and promotes disruptive behavior is very high on my list of top concerns. I published a paper a few years ago entitled Environmental Causes of Violence. We tend to think of people that get in trouble with the law, they grew up in a bad home or something like that. But we now understand that exposure to lead, exposure to PCBs, exposure to methylmercury from eating contaminated fish, all of these exposure, environmental tobacco smoke even, these are things that reduce IQ in children if they're exposed. But they also, it isn't just the parts of the brain that are involved in learning and memory. It also changes attention span, and it changes the ability to deal with frustrating events. So there's a tendency when you get frustrated to fly off the handle and do something that's basically can be crime. And studies now of people that are incarcerated find that most of them have a reduced IQ, which is a result of exposure to these chemicals. And many of them are in jail because of impulsive violent crime. So those things are all tied together. The other category, which it's sort of new on the block, but it's so important, are these chemicals that change our endocrine system, change our metabolism through actions on thyroid gland, change our reproductive actions through alteration of sex hormones. And there's so much exposure to these. Cosmetics, deodorants, plastics, all of these things. It's almost impossible to know how you reduce your exposure to these chemicals because they're such a part of our life. But they clearly are having severe and serious adverse health effects.
So David, I'm a pretty positive guy. I try to always end or live on a positive note. What are you most excited about in your life and in the future of the environment?
Well, I think the fact that you're talking to me about these things and many other people are talking about these things is a positive thing. Ignorance is the biggest barrier for anything that is bad. Now, it isn't to say that we're winning on all these battles, but we're getting a lot more press. We're getting attention of politicians and regulators. Certainly, we have contemporary setbacks. I mean, the EPA we have at present is a catastrophe and is trying to reverse a lot of the environmental safeguards that have been imposed, and many of those I thought were inadequate. But the public is understanding in more detail how important it is to not only reduce our own exposure, but to protect the environment for the sake of future generations. And that's positive. It's happening a little too slowly for my taste, but it is happening. And I think that's a good positive note to end on.
I think the unfortunate reality of the world is without massive amount of pain, people don't take action. So unless it's directly influencing somebody's life, they're not going to be compelled to jump on board and get behind this stuff, right? Like until somebody dies or until some large group of people die from PCBs or from EMFs or something, it's not that bad because, it's kind of like smoking, right? You don't really know how bad it is until you die of cancer.
That's right.
So yeah, it's an unfortunate reality that, sometimes people need a slap in the face before they're going to wake up. And hopefully we can incentivize and motivate people to take action on these things without needing that slap in the face or to have experienced cancer themselves.
Well, I certainly agree. A lot of the regulations we have occur because the politician's son or daughter or grandchild developed disease that was clearly a result of exposure.
Someone you love.
And we all care about the people we love, but we also care about the earth and the future of mankind. And that's really the call to take action at whatever level and every level that we can.
David, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your continued pursuit to educate on this stuff. And, like I say, this is awesome. I'm so grateful for this because as someone who has children, it's, for the first time in my life become a concern, because it seems as though we're digging a pretty deep hole for ourselves here, and hopefully we can stop digging and start filling it back in.
Thank you, Ben. Enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, David. Have an amazing day. I appreciate you.
Thanks.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.